Hi, my name is Kelvin Newman and welcome to the Brighton SEO podcast, where we share talks from one of the world's most popular search marketing conferences. The event started out as a few people meeting in an upstairs room of a pub and is now attended by over 3,000 people from all over the world. This episode is a recording of one of the speakers at a recent event.
Closing out the session, the third speaker in this technical SEO session, we've got Dawn Anderson. If we could give her a big round of applause, everybody.
Where's the thing? Hello? Oh, hold on. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me here? Here? Sorry, I'm just messing with you. Right, so you'll have to bear with me because I've had 5 weeks of laryngitis, so if I get a bit croaky or anything, you can just forgive me. Okay, so I wanted to talk about generational Cruft, and if people don't realise what that is, I'm going to explain in a bit more detail. It's something that I came across quite a few months ago, and I started to explore it in a bit more detail. And it was kind of around this time when the great 302 past PageRank debate started to kick off. And obviously, when Google said all of a sudden, well, actually, yes, 302s do pass PageRank as well as 301s, the whole SEO industry explodes. And I was watching the conversation on social media, and there was a debate kicked off in Google+, and John Mueller responded to a chap, Nicholas Chimonas, some of you will know here, about why things seem to take a little bit of time. Now, the point here is not whether 302s pass PageRank or not. It's really exploring the area of generational Cruft. And John mentioned generational Cruft, and ultimately he was really talking about some of the things that we kind of pick up over the years as we migrate and have various different websites. So this is not to be confused with Crufts. Now, obviously that's the world's largest dog show. And it's not also to be confused really with content Cruft, which is really one of the very few things I could actually find when I search for SEO and Cruft in Google. This is obviously where Rand talks about removing old content and just doing a good clean-up and making sure that you improve the quality of your pages out there. But this type of Cruft is not about content Cruft. It's if you know anything about John, you'll know he's previously a software engineer before he went to Google. So I thought, actually, he's probably talking about something to do with code. But actually, software Cruft is quite a big thing. It's kind of old and extraneous things. Is that a real word? I don't know, I just made it up. Things that get left behind, and lots of legacy things start to kick in as software starts to, well, it rots like anything else, gets old. And also, specifically, this is really about URL Cruft and the passing of signals. And again, when you do a search on URL Cruft, there's really not a lot out there. There's like this one page of relevant results. And again, you'll see it is not to be confused with the world's largest dog show, which actually is there in that set of results. Really what it relates to is lots of really like URLs that just end up being pointless other than to the person that actually created them in the first place. So they don't add any semantic meaning at all to the contents of a website. It's kind of all the random crap that people add to query strings. So analytics and session IDs and caches that just throw things in there. Directories and folders that you thought for 1 minute were a good idea and then you got rid of them. And they don't really have any great semantic meaning to the topic of your website as such. Because what happens is code and URL Cruft makes crawling really sluggish. Yeah. Part of the reason for that is there's a really famous paper actually that if you do get a chance to read, you should. Very famous quote, cool URIs don't change. And it's a quote by the inventor of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Basically what he says is, whatever you create, you should always, always think about it very, very carefully, because when you create a URL, it's there forever. You know, and obviously we need to, I'm not going to go into the semantics of the difference between a URI and a URL and a URN, but you should really explore that, because there is a big difference, yeah. So obviously URL is the address of the resource as such. So ultimately what he's saying is, if you make something, you cannot unmake it, and you have to really be thinking about it for the long, long term. So 20 years in the future, really, when you create any URLs. But this is the problem. What happens is, particularly on older sites and big legacy enterprise sites, big organisations that are not the most agile of companies out there, the more people join them, the less agile they seem to become. What tends to happen is the websites get messy and they just say, hey, let's start again. We're building a new site. We're building a new microsite. We're building a new subdomain. We're going to build this, that, and the other. They just seem to think you can just like clean the slate and start again. But this is not the case, because websites and URLs are not disposable. They have been created and they cannot be uncreated. And search engines have a lot of memory and a huge amount of storage, yeah, forever. But what happens is, when people often build these like new sites, they'll say, hey, well, will 301 or will 302, well, they won't, they'll probably say, well, we're not going to 302, we'll 301, but that's an aside. What they'll say is, we'll redirect everything, but we won't redirect some things because they won't be worth the redirection effort. So we'll just 404 them, or we'll 410 them, then they'll be gone, yeah, because obviously gone is gone. But in actual fact, gone is never gone. And in actual fact, the 404 is like the 302 of error pages. And what that means is that ultimately, it sends a stronger signal. So a 404 basically is the default of an error, and a 302 is the default of an error. So when you have a static, any kind of server, and anything that you redirect and you don't expressly say, we want it to be a 301, or you don't expressly say, we want it to be a 410, the 404 or the 302 are the defaults. They're the out of the box. They're like, well, they're the are you sure type of signal, if you like. So they have to be crawled a few times to be sure that actually that was the intent of the webmaster or the SEO or whatever. Yeah. And the 301 and the 410 are a break from the default path to, well, you knew what you were doing. You told us expressly, these are your instructions. So they don't have to be crawled quite as many times before the signals start to pass across. And this was clarified quite a long time ago. Still gets asked though, as many questions in SEO constantly get asked over and over as each new generation of SEOs come through. But this was asked by AJ Cohn, aka Blind 5-Year-Old, back in 2015. And when Matt Cutts used to do his weekly question time, who used to watch Matt Cutts' weekly question time? Yeah, a few of us, yeah. I love them, actually. I thought they were really good. You know, he answered the question there. He said, look, you took a definite path from the default, so you knew what you were doing. So it does mean that we're going to take notice of your 410s and your 301s quicker than your 302s or your 404s. But do not think for 1 minute that 410 is never going to get crawled again, because everything gets crawled again. In reality, gone is never gone. Again, John clarified this here when somebody was asking about, oh, well, what happened? I think it was me, actually. Yeah, there's me with my pigtails in. I kept seeing these like random sprays of 410s appearing in my server logs, and keep occasionally getting messages in Webmaster saying, we found a load of 404s or we found a load of 410s, but they were gone. They were gone a long time ago, in my mind. But no, what happens is, when something is being created, Googlebot will come back or get sent back when there's spare capacity to see if something came alive again. It's not the URL, that's just the address. It was the resource, it was gone, but now it might have come back. And the job of Google and search engines is to index all the information. And once a URL has been seen, it cannot be unseen. So how about this? I just had a route around and started looking for a few examples of people that were talking about URLs that keep coming back or keep getting crawled. This person was talking about 5 years ago. He had a URL, Google keeps coming to look for it. How about 14 years later for a post that somebody put up for 2 hours and Googlebot still keeps coming trying to visit? And what happens is when you end up with all these legacy redirected sites with lots of like straggly bits over the years, you end up with this conga line of legacy URLs, subdomains, and various protocols all chaining together, and a kind of a forever and ever and ever. Anybody know who Demis Roussos is? Okay, that was a gamble, but didn't pay off. Fair enough. Okay, so what happens is Googlebot can get where water couldn't as well. So you might think, oh yes, but I've not linked to that URL from within my site. Well, Googlebot seems to be able to find things. So obviously DNS stuff as well, and if something was ever there, if there was ever a link to it at any point, it knows. Obviously, it's the URL scene test. It's a record of it is there. And, often people will say, hey, but I've blocked it at robots. But no, especially if there was any kind of link to it, Googlebot will find it. And sometimes things will get indexed. And this is why you end up seeing lots of staging sites in the index, even for massive websites. I'm not going to talk about some of the ones that we've found, because they're pretty big. And really, they don't want to be in the index. But, it happens. And part of the problem is, obviously, keeping on top of all the URLs that are created out there is the problem, the challenge is not in indexing URLs for search engines, is in keeping everything up to date. Because obviously now we have not only static content being built by people from years ago, like as it used to be years ago when it was just webmasters. Now we have people tweeting and lots of user-generated content being added all the time. And so what happens is obviously incremental crawling as such never ends. It's not like batch crawling anymore, it just continues going round and round. And a lot of it is based on URL change frequency and historical data. So, and importance as well. It's called the crawling frontier. It's like the massive queue to be explored or revisited, as to check whether it's been updated. If it was important, we want to be that back to see whether it changed, so we've got the most current information. And what happens is URLs take their place, or they're placed in the frontier, the queue, the huge queue. The queue gets long and congested. The queue is associated not with just a website, but with an IP. So if you had previous multiple sites there, it's all associated with your IP. And even the random crap that you create, So all the various analytic strings, etc. If you're not blocking, at some point or another, you're going to get it added to queues. And who here does server log analysis? Actually digs in and starts to... There's some shocking things that you see, isn't there? Unbelievable. You'd be amazed. Because what happens is past data is a great predictor of future data. When crawling occurs, samples are taken and there are patterns that emerge of how often something changes, and it also helps with when Googlebot's likely to come back. But the problem is when there is inconsistency and when there is legacy and there's old things, it starts to skew all the data. And everything is based on rolling averages. So we know that in the history logs, for instance, it looks at an average of X past crawls. So a lot of the academic literature on crawling out there as well talks about averages of past X crawls. And obviously, importance is another thing based on averages of X past crawls. And importance contributes to how often Googlebot's going to come back to look at the URLs that have been queued from your site, from your server, etc. And this obviously will include everything that's ever been associated with you in the past. You see, what happens is when you migrate everything across to a new website, your new URLs have no history, but your old URLs have a lot of history. And we know that every URL that ever was is stored, and there's a record in it in the history logs. This is looking at like an architecture of the search engine, scheduling, etc., and the URL server, and the data from the history logs that actually contributes to how frequently search engine crawlers are going to come back and check to see whether anything's changed. And as I said, the whole notion of this is to be able to build probability and predictability patterns, not just for revisiting, but also for indexing, for ranking. And as I say, one of the main things is this notion of importance and also, as I say, change frequency, etc. And as crawling occurs and migrations happen and lots of old generational stuff is in place, these signals tend to, as I say, be about based around averages. So it can be that as you're transferring the signals across, it's kind of just takes a little bit of time. You can see here two URLs that are like migrating and swapping out important signals as such. And this is there from one of the patents that explains it a little bit more clearly. But also you can't just keep jumping the queue either to speed things up too much. Obviously we have like submit to the index, submit to Googlebot, fetches Googlebot, but that's kind of push indexing, and also XML sitemaps are a kind of form of push indexing, which are great, but there's only kind of so much you can do with that. What happens is, occasionally when you submit to index and do the push indexing, you're seen, you go on the URL seen test, you're checked. Well, we've seen this URL, does it need to be requeued? What happens is, you start off, you might get a little bit of a bump up, but because everything else is being crawled as well, you won't get crawled again, and everything else catches up to you. And obviously there's a limit. How many times do we spend like filling in the captcha and trying to match the street signs up when we submit anything to index? And also, as I say, patterns are built based on sampling as well. So lots of little tiny samples to get an idea of the URL structure and be able to be efficient and know which parts of the site not to crawl or which parts are more important than others. So for instance, we know that things like Magento and Drupal, etc., and e-commerce sites, for instance, have things like sort in their URL, or they'll have, paginate, page one or whatever. And obviously there is, this is kind of a way of search engines being able to be more efficient. There's a lot of research been done around this. One in particular is by a guy called Ziv Bar Youssef, who actually works for Google. Now, I don't think he did at the time when he did his research. And he did a piece called Do Not Crawl in the Dust. And that was basically based around efficiency. I cannot stress how important efficiency is, obviously, and scale. So many URLs out there. And what he found is that actually by building these iterative rules around how often to go back to certain things and how to work out importance of certain things, they were able to only crawl 26% of all URLs in the end by iteratively building these patterns and rules as such. So what happens is over the years, everything just starts to build up, yeah. You end up also, you get these big organizations that have these great ideas. Oh, we're going to move to a new application. We'll move to the newest type of CMS, easier to handle. Oh, all of a sudden, we've decided that WordPress actually can be for enterprise. Let's move to WordPress. It's easy. Let's move to Drupal. Let's move away from Joomla, because nobody really wants to be with Joomla. Let's do this, that, and the other. All these patterns are kind of built up, yeah. And at some point or another, if you had an e-commerce site, you had the potential to create exponentially multiplicative URLs. The minute you started adding new parameters, when code gets out of hand and it just goes crazy. And these all end up being queued at some point or another as well. And also what happens is, it seems to be that actually, this was on a video, this was Gary Yesh, talking about how when crawling patterns happen, if Googlebot or Google comes in and starts to see that there's a good part to a website, they'll put more crawling into it. So if they find that actually there's a nice arm of a site that's about trees, and they'll start to realise that actually the flowers part is good, etc., and they'll spend more of their time there. And if you look at server logs, you'll actually realise that actually there is a real good correlation between the quality parts of your site and where search engines tend to spend their time as well. And it actually is also talked about a lot in academic papers on crawling, the transitive nature of near duplicate content. That means if A is the same as B and B is similar to C, then A is considered to be a duplicate of C, which means that it's classed as lower, like potential duplicate as such. But efficiency as well is not just about scheduling, it's also about caching. There's been a huge amount of papers in the past about caching and near-term memory. Being able to whip something out quickly. Sorry, I just spat on the screen there. Sorry. I hope nobody's videoed that. I'm sure they have live streamed it. So it's a kind of the best way to think of it is, you know, Blue Peter, when they used to always be able to whip something out and say, here's one we made earlier, yeah. So it's kind of like that. It's like making sure that you have in the near-term memory all the really important stuff, and then all the really low and rubbishy important things don't get visited a lot or crawled a lot. They're not important, but still, they're still there in the pile. And also they have these, a lot of papers talk about things like the reuse tables. This is kind of around, you know, well, do we have to keep revisiting that really irrelevant paper that nobody's actually that interested in? I did read something, and I'm not going to labour too much the point on this, but I read quite a few papers as well that talked about crawl ordering by search impact. And kind of it makes sense, you know, if obviously something's an important document that triggers a lot of queries, the chances are that it's going to be visited a lot because it's important. And it's not just about PageRank, it's about, has it got impact as such? But, you know, that's a paper. And samples help to do things like model topics when crawling as well. And what happens is when you migrate lots of times, you kind of tend to lose like the topic strength. You've kind of broke your silo structure. You know, the strong topical strength within a silo is huge. But what happens is this is a notion called concept drift, and it relates to natural language processing. It's kind of well, we're not quite sure. Does this relate to this or this? It's based around probability, samples, yeah, of content, and term frequency and inverse document frequency. It's kind of the opposite of Boolean logic, which is a case of, are the words in the document yes, no, yeah. That's just a yes or no, ones and zeros. Fuzzy logic is more related to concept drift, which looks at degrees of truth, probability. So as signals are moving across, probability obviously descends on one, that it's related to a topic, and passes over to the other. But what happens is when you end up with lots and lots of URLs everywhere and history, the fuzziness starts to come in. You started off with a website, a nice clean website, maybe 20,000 URLs on an e-commerce site with very strong, you know, sections in it, very strong topical siloing. And then over the years, when you keep migrating, you end up with many URLs historically that may have been the candidate to start to rank. And the minute you start adding in www and HTTPS versions, fuzziness occurs, yeah. And there's loads of reasons for this. There's just a few. You end up with this wrong target ranking, swapping out, and sharp and volatile ranking fluxes. This site that I looked at had loads of that going on. And so it is. And also what happens as well is people do things where they end up with Cruft through, for instance, you know, what site-wide internal linking to HTTP versus HTTPS and cannibalization. Yeah, all legacy over the years. Part of the problem is people churn, internal team churns. I've got a client that I've worked with for quite a number of years, and I've kind of outlived the digital marketing team there internally twice because people come and go in organisations and nobody knows the history. It just, you know, people just move around. And external agency churn as well. It's really important that people kind of have a history and make sure somebody knows who looks after the domains, for instance, and knows what they've owned and where everything is stored. It's really important that when you're looking to find solutions to fix some of this stuff, for instance, sometimes you'll have to go back and do some neighbourhood checking because nobody in the company actually knows who's responsible for the domains or what they actually own or whether actually there is still an old site hosted somewhere with maybe things like HTTP access. It's important to make sure that once you do find out everything that's ever been owned, you then revalidate it all on Search Console because you'll find there'll still be crawling activity going on a lot of these old websites, yeah. And there are places where you can optimize and just gather it all together at the final destination. You might even find legacy manual action messages in there that you didn't know about. And then the thing is, when we talk about these rules, the crawling rules that are built over time, for me, this is the way of having your biggest input to helping with those rules. Rules are parameters as such, yeah. So many people don't seem to bother with parameter handling in Search Console, but it is the quickest way to be able to intervene and say, look, don't crawl that, do crawl this. That is a representative. You're actually feeding the rules in. You're actually saying, this is a narrowing, this is a filtering, this is sorting. It's a directive and it's a big gun. So just be really careful with that. People canonicalize wrong. It's another big issue. I did some work when I did my master's just recently, found that 47% of 200 odd technical SEOs that I surveyed thought rel equals next, rel equals prev is a form of canonicalization. It isn't. It's a completely different relationship altogether. So it's important that you know about these canonicalization rules. Lots of SEOs didn't realise that actually 301s and 302s are also forms of canonicalization. It's not just about the canonical tag. And a lot of people also didn't realise that hreflang is also a form of canonicalization. There's a lot of things could go wrong when you start to redirect lots of things and have a lot of content, a lot of history, and it can end up a real spaghetti mess. Cruft, yeah. This is some of the signals, and what happens is, if the canonical, for instance, is not valid, you end up with this default fallback to pre-canonical rules. And that basically can be things as much as internal links. Because that's actually in the RFCs, which is the request for comments that actually talks about internal signals and robots, etc. RFC 6596 relates to the canonical link relation, so it's well worth looking at that. But actually, what you'll see is when you've had historical internal links to anything, you can really have a problem getting old domains out of the index when you're trying to migrate. Really spend some time learning about these and understanding them more. What else happens? People tend to append things. Instead of removing CSS styles, people add more on, add more on, add more on. Things get longer, bigger, more cruft. And every time you load a CSS, you're loading all the images. JavaScript files just get huge. People create additional ones and just ends up with all the further cruft. You need to see what's on the server. You need to see what XML sitemap was added there and was not deleted, because they're really powerful XML sitemaps. You need to be able to understand what's gone before. You need to be able to do some proper diagnoses on server log files, but watch out, because there'll be other things in there, like our tools that we use for log file analysis sometimes and crawling, they're in there emulating Googlebot. You'll start to see some patterns emerging, but realise that actually a lot of this stuff is from a long time ago. It's still in there, yeah. You need to revisit all past htaccess files, and you will find actually that if you've had 3 or 4 sites in the past and you still have htaccess files in there, you could have loads of rules that you could potentially just chop it all back, reduce it down massively. As Peter says, it slows it down, and if you've got various sites, then passing one to the other, you need to maybe look at rewriting with things like wildcards, or even just removing it and redirecting the site at DNS. Chop it all back, and this will help with speed, but also speed. I'm not going to cover speed too much here, but speed is the big order of the day. XML sitemaps, massively undervalued, and they send, if you like, this is one of the strongest signals of what are the important URLs on a site, given that something may have had, old sites may have had hundreds of thousands URLs associated with them and their IP overall in history. They help to be able to pick out the important key URLs. What's in there is important, and if you can use custom ones, all the better. So for instance, I use this Pro Sitemap generator. It allows me to configure the sections of a site I want to add and what I don't. And it's something a lot of SEOs don't have control over their XML sitemaps. If they're dealing with a large organisation, the developers or maybe Magento spits just everything out. But actually, you need to be able to get some control. And you can even externally host sitemaps like this and validate it on Google Search Console. Yep, that's able to be done. You can cut past the devs then. Instead of remove, consider distract and iteratively improve. Yeah, because everything that's been created, if you can avoid getting rid of it as such, don't just make things and then delete them. If you can make things better, all the more. You need to rebuild in your conceptual stuff as well, as quickly as you possibly can. Things like, looking at natural language processing and building things like structured sitemaps and topical hubs, massively strong and powerful, and increase importance. Not going to go through all that. It's going to be on SlideShare anyway. But there's lots of signals that you can do to strengthen up the signals to search engines and reduce the importance in the old stuff to balance it out. And then eventually, do look at content craft. I'm not a fan of remove, as I say. I'm a fan of improve as much as you possibly can. It's very important that you stay out of the server error status as much as possible, because also what I've discovered, what I see supported in literature is there is this notion of because of the notion of crawling politeness, and the rules of crawling are do not hurt the website, do not hurt the website, do not hurt the website, is that ultimately you need to make sure that you're not getting lots of 500 errors, because the extended time before they'll try again it keeps getting extended, and the crawling will drop away more, and the momentum takes time to pick up again. Consistency is key. Remember, everything is about rolling averages. And there's huge amounts in the appendix, 50 slides in there. And that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dawn.
This was originally recorded at a Brighton SEO conference. If you want to listen to more episodes or find out about the conference itself, you can do at brightonseo.com.